We're about to start in, I think, what, 2 more minutes, Peter?
Whenever you're ready, John.
Oh. Aye. Okay. Let's begin. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Nice to see all of you. Thank you. Nice to see you all. Tonight we are on week 2 of Love in the Age of Coronavirus. And after spending some time with the book of Job last week, I originally thought what we could do is look at 2 of C.S. Lewis's books, The Great Divorce and A Grief Observed, which was the last book he wrote. These 2 books grapple with many of the same issues we see in Job, but in a very different way. And then as I was reviewing them, I realized I was leaving a couple things out that we need to sort of give a little more depth. So I'm going to go a little bit beyond what we were originally talking about and discuss it really by means of contrast, predominantly the problem of pain, which was Lewis's 1944 book, the last of his World War II era apologetics, and his reflections on the Psalms. We're going to talk about them in the context of explaining A Grief Observed and The Great Divorce, and seeing what light they may bring to us in this time. I'm also going to recommend for anyone who wants to read about Lewis, there are several biographies. To my mind, the best remains A.N. Wilson's C.S. Lewis, a biography. There are some more recent biographies that are very interesting. Alistair McGrath wrote one that was quite good on Lewis's thought, but really glosses over a lot of his life. Wilson, I think, strikes a better balance in really getting into who Lewis was as a person and giving a flavor of the man. And I think McGrath, for all of his really good analysis of Lewis's theology and his good points, has a tendency to be overly protective of him. So, for example, there was a debate between Elizabeth Anscombe and Lewis, where Anscombe, who was a professional philosopher, basically cleaned Lewis's clock. He was utterly defeated. He thought he went in there thinking he was going to have a righteous romp and confute the philosopher. And instead, she basically blew him out of the water, to the point that he never wrote Christian apologetics in the same way again. What he did instead was he wrote more reflective books. And he started first by writing some fiction, and fiction led him to do more parable writing, like The Great Divorce. And he really never came back to the sort of logic-based analysis of theology that he did in the World War II era. And those books, Mere Christianity, The Problem of Pain, which we'll be talking about tonight, those books have been, for many people, wonderful introductions to some of the harder points of Christian doctrine to get on terms with. And I don't in any way mean to disparage them or the Problem of Pain. But as a reader of Lewis, I personally believe that those later books have a richness and a depth that the more persuasive apologetics that he did in the wartime era and for a little while thereafter until he was defeated by Anscombe in the debate. I think that those later books have a greater richness of thought and of feeling and represent the best of his Christian writing. Lewis himself, by the way, acknowledged that Anscombe had bested him completely. And he wrote a letter in which he just flat out admitted it. Anscombe herself didn't think it was such a one-sided affair. She was actually rather impressed with Lewis's argument, considering he wasn't a philosopher. But as Wilson says, the debate showed that Lewis was not equipped to debate a professional philosopher on her own terms. And so Anscombe's victory over Lewis in that debate had a great effect on his life, but actually didn't reduce his standing with people who followed matters theological or philosophical. It was simply Lewis had a bad night and lost a debate. But he took quite a strong lesson from it. Anyway, a little bit about who the man we're dealing with, just because I think it helps to give some background. Lewis was born in 1898 in Belfast. He was the son of a police court solicitor who was very argumentative, reasonable, logical, lawyerly. And he was a very good solicitor. And Wilson would say, and does say in his biography, that the apologetics that he did in the wartime era have a savor of the police court rhetoric to them. That is, they proceed on setting up assumptions, making the argument for the assumptions, and then from those assumptions, making the arguments on why Christian doctrine, as it has been since the Council of Nicaea, is good, reliable, and conducive to a better grounding of a life in God and in Christ. So Lewis was very much his father's son. His brother Warren Lewis, known to everyone as Warnie, found himself in the military. Lewis served in World War I in the foxholes and had some genuinely terrifying experiences. He and a friend, Patty Moore, agreed that if the other died, the survivor would take care of the parent remaining alone. Patty Moore died, leaving C.S. Lewis to care for Jane Moore, his mother. The relationship between between Jane Moore and C.S. Lewis is hotly debated by biographers of Lewis. There are those who say that she became a mother figure to him. There are those who say that Mrs. Moore, who wasn't as much older than Lewis than his own father was, became a romantic entanglement for him. There is no proof either way. No one knows. All we know is this: Lewis took care of Mrs. Moore until the day she died. Their relationship seemed to be very strong and very deep. And there were some people who felt that it was more than a surrogate motherhood relationship, but that it verged on if it didn't actually cross over into the romantic. Wilson makes that argument based on certain passages in Lewis's early writing. Why do I mention it here? Because the grief in A Grief Observed is for the loss of Lewis's wife, Joy Davidman. And she was the only documented, clearly undisputed romantic figure in his life. They only had a few short years together. Joy died of cancer. She started off as being everything that he wasn't: atheist, scathingly witty. Well, they shared that actually. They were both quite funny. But she was very much a person of the 1940s and the 50s, in that she started out as an active communist, converted from Judaism abandoned her Judaism for atheism, then converted from atheism to Anglicanism, based upon, in part, the writings of C.S. Lewis, but also Dorothy Sayers and other writers. She was strong-minded, had 2 children who became Lewis's stepsons, and their romance caused quite a lot of astonishment. Lewis had, in print, said that marrying after a divorce was clearly not permissible in the Bible and therefore couldn't be done. Mrs. Moore Joy Davidman was a divorcee when they married, and Lewis married her thinking that she might die. Her cancer was in its first iteration, nearly took her then. She received a remission from cancer, which Lewis thought to be miraculous. They had several happy years together. And when she died in 1960, A Grief Observed emerged from his very stricken mind. Why do I say stricken? Not just grief-stricken. Lewis's book, The Problem of Pain, the earliest of his wrestling with the subject of grief and loss, is academic in feel, although it's not written in academic jargon or philosophical jargon. What it is it's a very logical summary of, do we believe that God is good? If we believe that God is good, then we must believe that the experience of pain is not simply sent by a demon god out of Descartes, the great deceiver, who is seeking to hurt us for the sake of hurting us. And Lewis goes through inductive and deductive reasoning in various points in the book to come to the conclusion that the purpose of pain in our lives is to bring us back to God by not letting us be so immersed in our own experience of the joys of creation, living life as the created, that we lose sight of the creator. In other words, it's sort of a way of making us love life less so that we might love God more. I will point out that although it's a very short book, it's only 148 pages, counting the index, I am really stripping it down to its basest core. I will also confess that when I first read The Problem of Pain, it was, to my mind, the least satisfactory of Lewis's apologetics. I would say that the book is not entirely without heft. It's more detached than his later books, but it also does have some very lovely passages in it where Lewis is speaking about the love of God and seeking to explain how God's love does not result in us being hurt so we can learn moral lessons, but rather that our fallen state, which Lewis views as simply the fact that we are the descendants of those who created a worse and worse world. And as our time has come to live in this world, the modern world, we live with the decisions for good and for bad made by generation upon generation upon generation, all the way past the Old Testament, and it's first being put into words. And so we live in a world in which a lot of pain has come grafted in by human behavior. And so God uses that pain, those unpleasant experiences, those feelings of loss, as ways of trying to break down barriers we have erected between ourselves and God. Now, this is not a particularly enjoyable book. There are some beautiful passages in it, and there are some very funny passages in it. And Lewis, as always, is a witty and absorbing writer. It feels to me, to this reader, there are many people who love this book. The Problem of Pain, I'm mentioning it because it's so schematic and so from Lewis's head that you only get brief glimpses of Lewis's heart in it. And so I mention this because I think it stands in great distinction to the main books we're talking about tonight as basically a failed effort. Again, there are many Lewis fans who would be furious with me. And if this goes on lines, I expect to get flamed by many Lewis fans because most real diehard fans of C.S. Lewis will say that those wartime books made disciples in the middle of the Blitz, and they're right. So while I acknowledge the value of the book, for me, it doesn't work because it isn't as warm and as personal and it isn't as close to the heart. I'll give you an example, and then we'll be moving off The Problem of Pain. The Problem of Pain begins. Not many years ago, when I was an atheist, if anyone had asked me, "Why do you not believe in God?" my reply would have run something like this: "Look at the universe we live in. By far the greatest part of it consists of empty space, completely dark and unimaginably cold. The bodies which move into space are so few and so small in comparison with the space itself that even if every one of them were known to be crowded as full as it could hold with perfectly happy creatures, it would still be difficult to believe that life and happiness were more than a byproduct of the power that made the universe." From there, Lewis goes on to reason down to the earth and its creatures. So it's very much deductive and inductive reasoning being used throughout the book. But let's go for a moment to the opening of A Grief Observed. And I think you'll see a major difference. "No one ever told me that grief felt so much like fear. I'm not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. The same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness, the yawning. I keep on swallowing. At other times, it feels like being mildly drunk or concussed. There is a sort of invisible blanket between the world and me. I find it hard to take in what anyone says, or perhaps hard to want to take it in. It is so uninteresting. Yet I want the others to be about me. I dread the moments when the house is empty. If only they would talk to one another and not to me. You can see the difference, right? One is from the heart, right as the heart has been riven. The other is predominantly intellectual. And as someone who loves intellectual scholarship, and by the way, Lewis's career as a scholar was predominantly in medieval literature, and he has written marvelous things that to this day are still highly regarded by those who teach and do scholarship in those fields. But Lewis's cry of anguish at the beginning of A Grief Observed is unlike anything else in his work. It's incredibly powerful, incredibly concrete, and not at all an argument for anything. He's writing from his own current experience as he's doing the writing. And that, to me, I think is what makes the book so powerful. So, before we get into The Great Divorce, which is the first book we're going to talk about at length, I want to talk a little bit about Lewis and the Psalms. Because in my career as an Anglican, by which I mean when I left the group of being unchurched and came into the Episcopal Church, one of the first people to assist me in finding my way was J.D. Clark, my predecessor as deacon at St. Bart's. And J.D. said, what you should do is you should pray the daily office. Now, the daily office, of course, has several set psalms for every day of the calendar of the church year. And it doesn't hide what have been called the vindictive psalms, or Lewis calls them this is a phrase for them, I rather like it. He calls them the maledictory psalms. And these are the psalms that, shall we say, are cries for vengeance. And the really tricky thing about these psalms is that they are the portions which are maledictions and curses and cries of wrath are embedded in some of the most beautiful of the psalms. Even the 23rd psalm, which is joyful, and the Lord is my shepherd, there's nothing I shall want, and oh, everything is wonderful, oh, and best of all, not only does my cup runneth over, but my enemies have to watch. They have to be miserable knowing how happy I am. And that by the standards of the vindictive psalms, that's light. So I want to discuss briefly the Psalms. This is chapter 3 of Reflections from the Psalms. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of Lewis here. In some of the Psalms, the spirit of hatred, which strikes us in the face, is like the heat from a furnace mouth. In others, the same spirit ceases to be frightful only by becoming, to a modern mind, almost comic in its naivete. Examples of the first can be found all over the Psalter, but perhaps the worst is in 109. The poet prays that an ungodly man may rule over his enemy and that Satan may stand at his right hand. Now, this does not probably mean what a Christian reader naturally supposes, that Satan is an accuser or an informer. When the enemy is tried, let him be convicted and sentenced, and let his prayer be turned into sin. May his days be few, may his job be given to someone else. When he is dead, may his orphans be beggars. May he look in vain for anyone in the world to pity him. Even more devilish in one verse is this, the otherwise beautiful Psalm 137, where a blessing is pronounced on anyone who will snatch up a Babylonian baby and beat its brains out against a pavement. And we get the refinement of malice in 69, verse 23, let their table be made a snare to take themselves withal, and let the things that should have been for their wealth be unto them an occasion of falling. He finally adds Psalm 143, almost like an afterthought, and of thy goodness, slay my enemies. And Lewis's point in raising this is actually exactly why I needed him to raise it, which is when I first read the Psalms, I was appalled. I read them in the course of the daily office. I was appalled by the vindictiveness and the cruelty in some of the Psalms. And it's really quite staggering. And you never know when it's going to happen until you learn the daily office over the years. But, you never know whether you're going to be reading a lovely psalm that's just going to be nice and soothing and comforting, or we're going to be, can we slay the wicked? And by the way, let's break a few babies' heads. And you never know what you're getting. So what do you do with these? What do you do with these psalms? And what do they have to do with what we're talking about here? Lewis's response is that the vindictive songs or the imprecatory psalms, whatever you want to call them, these come from people who have been enslaved. These are songs written in the exile where everything seems to have failed. The covenant with God has failed. The kingdom has failed. These are basically primal screams. And he says, you should read them as such. You should not excuse them. In fact, I'm going to give you, because it's such a perfect way of putting it, I'm going to resort to him again. He makes the point, at the outset I felt sure, and I feel sure still, that we must not either try to explain these psalms away or yield for one moment to the idea that because it comes in the Bible, all this vindictive hatred must somehow be good and pious. We must face both facts squarely. The hatred is there, festering, gloating, undisguised, and also we should be wicked if we in any way condoned or approved it, or worse still, used it to justify similar passions in ourselves. These maledictions are interesting in one way, in that they express themselves with perfect freedom, without disguise, without self-consciousness, without shame, as few but children would express it today. And doesn't that tie us back to Job last week? Think of how Job does not curse God, but he laments his fate. He inveighs against the injustice of his situation. And without cursing God, he is nonetheless drawing God's goodness into dispute. Not directly, possibly not even intentionally. But the fact of the matter is, Job is on trial in the eyes of the three accusers. God is on trial in Job's mind and heart. Likewise, the Hebrews, for whom these psalms were meaningful and profound, are shattered by loss. Their faith has been shattered. Their hope has been shattered. They are grieving. And that grief pours out of them without limitation, without restriction, without prettying it up, and without making it pious. So there's a value to it, Lewis says, in that it lets you see into the hearts and minds of those who compose these psalms. But it does not make the sentiments expressed any less evil. And the only hope that Lewis finds in them is that they are a step on a way to rebuilding a life in faith in God for those who write them. So it's like the rush of fury and anger and feelings of injustice that typified Job. And yet at the end, Job is reconciled and indeed vindicated by God. So not unlike ourselves in this time where we are seeing, we've passed, as of today, 100,000 deaths in this nation alone from the coronavirus. Last week, I put us in the 90s. I was actually somewhat short. I think it was actually 94,000 when last we spoke. I mention this because we are seeing an extraordinary amount of division and wrath in all kinds of places. We're seeing national figures make statements about other national figures that you would never have seen that we've never seen since the 19th century, And I'm talking about in the era before the Civil War. We have the President of the United States accusing a TV show host who used to be a Republican representative in the House of murder because he criticized the president. I make the point not to be political. I make the point to say that we are seeing protests of masks, of mask wearing, and people who wear masks getting shouted at in the street because they're wearing masks, because the masks are taking on tribal symbolism in the eyes of some people. And again, this is not widely spread. These are in pockets, but we see them in states throughout the Union. Look at what happened in Michigan with the protests there. And on one side, you've got people wearing masks and nurses wearing masks and doctors wearing masks. On the other, you have people touting very large guns and declaiming not only anyone from trying to make them wear masks, but anyone who would wear a mask themselves. I don't say this to indict anybody. I say it to say that we are living in a fractured time. And in this fractious time, we do not seem to have the sort of unity that we have had in the wake of past catastrophes. September 11th did not divide us. We actually came closer together in the wake of September 11th. I know this because the law firm for which I worked at the time had an office at the Trade Center. Our people were spared. By good fortune, they were all out to another office for a firm-wide meeting that just happened not to be in the World Trade Center office. I was down in DC. When we all came together, we were a part of that wave of national unity and purpose that almost everyone seemed to be feeling or reflecting in September 11th, after September 11th, and which has perpetuated itself in the very welcoming services that our church does every year to honor the fallen, to honor those who served through that time period. And where that crisis brought unity, this one has brought division and rancor. So how do we deal with it? How do we love? Lewis gives us a piece in Reflections on the Psalms. We do not justify hatred. We acknowledge that it's there. We try to see why it's there and to understand, because to understand is the first step towards forgiveness. But we do not accept hatred, and we do not, as Lewis writes, most importantly of all, we don't allow ourselves to be guided down the paths of returning hatred for hatred. Well, that's really easy for me to say, right? I'm sitting here in my nice little study here up in Albany. But living it, considerably harder, right? So one of the reasons why Reflections on the Psalms is an important piece of the bridge work we're trying to do is, how did Lewis go from the man who, in the middle of war, broadcast Christian apologetics, which took a lot of faith, but started from a purely intellectual position, and with charm and with humor and wit, made that compelling to his audience, but go into what I would consider a much more deeper and powerful relationship with his listeners, with his readers, and most of all with God. Because the Lewis of Reflections on the Psalms is not the same Lewis of The Problem of Pain. And certainly not the Lewis of A Grief Observed. Now, in moving on from Reflections on the Psalms, I think it's really important to say that forgiving our ancestors, those who came before us, who left us great riches, liturgical riches, spiritual riches, a record of their journey as they saw it, as their people saw it. John Collins writes that one of the great things about the Hebrew Bible is that they threw nothing out. And I've always enjoyed that. There are stories that don't fit together, and yet they appear. So my favorite is in Genesis. We find all of a sudden, Abram becomes Abram the Hebrew, and you suddenly realize this story is actually being told from the perspective of the Canaanites, to whose rescue Abraham has come. And suddenly Abram's a guest star in someone else's story, but it makes it into Genesis because nothing about their forefathers was to be discarded. And so you've got in Kings and Chronicles, Saul is unsympathetic in one and much more sympathetic in the other. There's no perfect continuity because all the various truths, all the various retellings, all the versions of the story are set down together. And so what Lewis is doing is he's helping us to sift for the gold, which is not the imprecatory parts of the Psalms. Understand them, forgive them, be grateful for what they've left us and given us, but move on to the beauty, to the story of God's love, to the human response in love, and the fact that despite our failing again and again, God never gives up on us. And so we get to the Great Divorce. Has anyone here had a chance to read The Great Divorce before? Lovely. Okay. So, The Great Divorce is it's one of my favorite of Lewis's fictions because it is so bold. And he's actually basing it it's a counterpoint to William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And this is Lewis divorcing heaven from hell. And that's the great divorce of the title. The story begins as a dream. And Lewis is transported to a very dreary suburb that is where it's always raining and overcast. Not raining enough that you're not going to go out, but just enough that you're going to be unhappy if you go out. And everyone there is very boring and just very caught up in themselves. But there's a bus coming. And people want to go on the bus, even though they don't think it's going to be that great a deal. The bus isn't all that important, but all right, I'll go on the bus. Why not? It's better than just staying home. And if my rendition of that sounds a little bit like Eeyore, I grew up on those cartoons, so my apologies. So they go on the bus, and the bus flies away from the suburb. And they land in a place that is very, very bright and very, very clear, but also much bigger than they are. The blades of grass are so solid that people can get cut on them, the people from the suburb. And only slowly does our narrator, Lewis, realize that what's actually happening is it's because everything in the suburb is so tiny and so unreal and so barely existing that here in this real place, which is not heaven, they're outside of heaven. But they're in a place where reality is so much more solid than they are that they seem tiny and barely present. So what happens is the people could leave the bus, and after a few injuries at the hands of daffodils and blades of grass, they meet other people who they knew in life and who remember them and have come to hopefully help them become fully themselves again and enter into heaven. And most of them don't make it. Most of them don't. A couple come close and fail at the end. One who styles himself as a great tragedian is really close, but he loves the melodrama that has pervaded his whole life so much that he can't quite let it go and just accept that actually he was just a guy who had a messed up relationship with a woman. She messed up, he messed up, it was unpleasant, and instead he has to create in it some great romantic tragedy and be Byron-esque about it. And so he goes back, failing. But some do make it. And we see a figure who, and you'll see why I introduced her earlier, there's a figure of a woman surrounded with people and animals and life. And she sweeps through with great joy and her presence brings happiness and makes people more aware of the beauty of where they are and their chance to be there, and helps one person make the final decision to stay. What's interesting about that is that person is based on Jane Moore, who Lewis took in after Patty Moore died in World War I. And all of the biographers basically agree this is Jane Moore. And Jane Moore was known for always having lots of animals around her. She was very sociable, very voluble, very charming. And this is a this is a portrait of Jane Moore perfected at her best self realized. And so Lewis is, I believe, saying that when we are loving God and accepting God's love for us, even the dogs can accept God's love. And but even the animals who follow Jane Moore take a life from her as she takes life from God. And Lewis's point, no joking, is that we are all at our most fully ourselves when we care least about ourselves and most about loving others and God. And so Jane Moore, who when she died was a rather crotchety and upset old woman, who was frightened that Lewis might be getting ready to send her off to a nursing home, in fact, has the makings of a saint. And I don't mean a saint in the sense of the Catholic Church or the Episcopal Church, saying a person of great spiritual heroism whose devotion has changed the world visibly such that they are recognized and celebrated on the calendar, but rather in St. Paul's reference of all of us as saints. And to foreshadow Nadia Bolz-Weber in 2 weeks, Bolz-Weber, of course, says we are all sinners and all saints, and both all the time. So Lewis is here, I think, please.
Yes, this lady is so loved. Everybody loves her. And these people from Earth, the dwarf and the tragedy guy, the actor, they feel that love means you need me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not really love. That's not the kind of love that she's talking about. And
right.
She's full of joy, and they won't let joy. They want to keep wallowing in pity.
Mm-hmm.
And they think that if you feel sorry for them, that they're going to drag you into their pity. And you can't do that with somebody who has got God in their life and that's loving and joyful. She couldn't be dragged into that. And they decided to go back to the earth, or they shrunk and they went away.
Right.
Yeah, they didn't make it to the next step.
That's right.
But the need, that's not love.
Right. It's the same thing with the mother who wants her son back and the wife who wants her husband back so she can tyrannize over him. And she gets all excited. And for a moment, it looks like there's going to be a conversion and she's going to be able to let everything go. But she wants her husband back, not so that she can love him, but rather so she can torment him and possess him.
Control him. Yeah.
Yes. Control and possession are
Mm-hmm.
the obverse side of love in this story. And of course, the suburb is hell. But it's a very unusual kind of hell because it's hell that is only locked from the inside. And this comes up in The Problem of Pain. Lewis forecasts this in The Problem of Pain and comes back to it at great length in The Great Divorce. In The Problem of Pain, he says that he believes that at some point God will say, "Thy will be done," and will not force us to receive grace. And so The Great Divorce is the working out of that passage from The Problem of Pain. And it's Lewis revisiting what he said about hell in that earlier book.
He gives people a lot of choice. Everybody has choice. to either be
Right.
in that space, hold on to their addictions, their pain, their control,
Mhm.
or be in this good space. And at the end, he says that nobody who, the bad people can't bring the good people down to them.
Mhm.
They have so much joy that they stay elevated in that good space, but they try.
Mhm.
The bad people who are miserable try to make the good people miserable, but in his world, in this dream, in this parable, it doesn't happen. So that's good.
So a recurring theme in Lewis is that the blessed cannot be held to ransom by those who refuse to accept the blessing. That if you want to wallow in guilt and self-hatred and self-loathing and sin, and to make drama out of that and to base your identity around your flaws by not accepting the forgiveness and the grace of God, you can't hold anyone else to ransom that way. It's basically saying, if I alone am not happy, no one can be happy. And that's not crying for mercy. That's crying for dominance. That's seeking to control and to manipulate others. So,
Time I was reading this, I was
Mhm.
recollecting Lincoln in the Bardo, because have you read that book?
I haven't. Please tell us about it a little bit.
It's about Abraham and his son dying. It's kind of based on a Buddhist idea of the Bardo, but which is roughly equivalent to purgatory, but very roughly. But
Mhm.
Lincoln can't let go of his son at first, and he holds him in the grave. But it's all about all the people who can't let go of what was holding them back. And the thing that reminded me of it particularly was when somebody got close to making that transition, there was loud music and trumpets and beautiful things, you know. So it was just an incredible, it was just like a parallel all the way through. And I love that book. I think it's a fabulous book.
I'll look it up. Thank you.
Who's the boy, Chris?
Called Lincoln in the Bardo. And
Do you know the author's name?
Buddhist concept, but
Okay.
um, it's just such an interesting book. But it is exactly
Mhm.
to the Great Divorce. Exactly.
It's interesting because Lewis was very staunchly non-Catholic, although he wasn't anti-Catholic. In fact, his correspondence included many Roman Catholics. And one wonders how he would have felt about this. His executor, by default, because he didn't name one, Walter Hooper, has become a very staunch Roman Catholic. But he was attracted by the concept of purgatory. He thought that the notion that immediately after death, one would either be consigned to hell or instantly cured of all sin didn't feel psychologically or spiritually sound to him, even though he uses it at the end of the Screwtape Letters, where the devils see the soul suddenly slough off all their sins and be pulled up to heaven. But that was something that concept did not sit comfortably with Lewis. And it's one of the few real big dents in his Anglicanism. The vain and popish doctrine called purgatory had tremendous attraction for him. So it's an interesting, it's fascinating. I didn't know anything about Lincoln and the Bardo. I'll look that up, and thank you so much for that. I do appreciate it.
One of the best books I've ever read. I'll just say that.
Well, thank you. So when you go to The Great Divorce, there's the mentor character who basically plays the same role that is played by Virgil in Dante's Inferno. He is the tour guide. And the character is another writer, a 19th century writer called George MacDonald, of whom Lewis was a great admirer. His most famous book is called Fantasies, and he wrote basically, to call them fairy tales is to not give them their due. They're much more literary, and there's an edge of darkness to him. H.P. Lovecraft actually admired him, as did many of the circle who grew around that sort of darker fairy tale / horror or early horror genre. But Lewis loved him as a writer and thought that there was real spiritual insight in what he wrote. And so there's a certain amount of comedy in the way MacDonald's presented. He's given a very Scotch burr, which is reproduced throughout the entire book. And he's constantly cutting Lewis down to size and reminding Lewis of his fallibility and his mortality. And certainly he's no Dante. And that's a running joke throughout the book. But he's also Virgil, of course, in Dante is the virtuous pagan who is not allowed to get into heaven, but is allowed to guide Dante towards purgatory and towards heaven, and is admirable and yet not admirable. He's admirable in and of himself, but he's not quite finished. And MacDonald comes off as a more settled and admired figure. Lewis's clear love for him as a writer and as a person shows through, and it makes those scenes, I find them very funny and a little bit touching. But he's more than just a guide. He's someone who has attained what Lewis in this rendering wants. So on The Great Divorce, the reason for the title is not just the play on William Blake. It's also the fact that C.S. Lewis fundamentally believes that heaven and hell cannot have any truck with one another. And the most that can happen is this occasional bus trip up to heaven where people might still be saved from hell. And the logic is that for heaven to enter into hell, to have any kind of dealings with hell other than this little trickle of visitors, would be to accept the blackmail that the unhappy should be able to control the blessed, and the willfully unhappy. Because again, the only handle on the door is on the inside. They can leave. That's also a concept that he first introduces in The Problem of Pain. So, in terms of being a resource, I think one of the great things that Lewis brings to us is he is constantly reiterating, love God, love your neighbor, and you can't go too far wrong. For Lewis, it's all about open-hearted love and joy. His autobiography, which he wrote when he was seeing Joy Davidman before they were married, was called Surprised by Joy, and in fact, joy was the surprise in the autobiography. But what he referred to often were these early experiences of the numinous that he had when he was a boy. And he didn't think of them then as experiences of the numinous, i.e. of the, trying to think of a good way to phrase the numinous. The numinous is the manifestation, the feeling or vision, depending on if you're a mystic or not, the awareness of the grandeur and the glory and the beauty of creation as a ramification, as linked to God the Creator. The numinous is one step away from what Lewis calls the uncanny, which is those moments where things feel like the barriers between spirit and flesh are very thin. But rather, but goes another step and brings us to the experience of awe, A-W-E, awe. And for him, the response to the numinous is that it is so grand and so glorious and so powerful that we can't help but feel something that's a little bit like fear. And he quotes actually The Wind in the Willows. This is one of the great things about Lewis, is that, you know, he doesn't quote theologians, he doesn't quote the medieval classics he was such an expert on in books like this. He quotes The Wind in the Willows. And at one point, the mole and the rat see the great god Pan. And Mole says to Rat, "Are you afraid of him?" "Afraid of him? No, no, of course not. What? He's wrapped with love." And yet he is a little afraid of him. Not that he's going to do anything unkind or be unkind, but just because he is so much more alive than they, that Mole and Rat can't help but be a little bit afraid. And so for Lewis, the numinous is being brought face to face, not unlike those shrunken figures who get on the bus, with the absolute reality that underlies all of creation, and how those blades of grass could be like swords, because the true creation, the numinousness that stems from the Godhead, is so more real than the world in which we live. I doubt I'd have passed a theology exam with that explanation of the numinous, particularly The Wind in the Willows, but I'm trying to explain it as Lewis defines it in The Problem of Pain, and he refers to it indirectly in The Great Divorce, but he doesn't, unlike The Problem of Pain, he doesn't do any definitions or much explaining, except through the voice of MacDonald, who allows him to have a narrator, who has someone in addition to the narrator who can comment and explain things without getting into philosophical or theological tangles. So, yes, Kathy.
There's one thing that he says in The Great Divorce that I don't understand if this is a theological question or what. He said that once you're in heaven, all the things that were bad before in your life are erased almost. And is that a belief that he had?
I think, yeah.
Yeah, I have the page number here somewhere, but I wrote it down like, that's interesting. Maybe Troy overcame all the bad stuff. I don't know.
As I see it, because remember, the various figures who come out to see the travelers have experienced unhappiness with them and been a part of their lives. And so it's not so much that it's forgotten, it's that it's so low on the priority list that it feels like forgotten. You know, when they see the travelers, they're very hopeful that they'll come and be fully human and join in creation and become their best selves and their full selves. But they're not worrying about it before the bus gets there. And they're not thinking of their old lives. They're on to their new lives. And those new lives, of course, we don't really get much depiction of. So it's more that the past no longer has the power to haunt. And I think that's a really great segue into how this book speaks to us. One of the reasons I picked this is because to talk about is because, first of all, I just like wrestling with this book every few years, because there's a lot in it and it reads so simply and as a straightforward little story. And, you know, some of the hints are really overt, but it's actually the subtle stuff that gets me on like a third or a fourth reading. And one of the ones that I really value is this notion that healing is part of what makes us fit to be really in spiritual communion with each other. In other words, we're not all here because we are all right, I'll give an example that I think works better. As someone who's gone to AA meetings for 24 years, the first time I got myself down the stairs, I had no idea what to expect. I just knew I needed to do this. And I got into the room, And to my astonishment, the room was rocking with laughter. People were happy. They were funny. They told stories that were worse than any experience I ever had, and they laughed at themselves. And it was a cleansing laughter, not a scathing laughter. And I think that's part of what Lewis is depicting here, that we heal, and we don't need to go revisiting the old scab over and over again. And I think, Kathy, that's part of what the passage you were referring to is about, is that they're not living in their memories. They're not obsessing over their lost ones who didn't make it up to heaven in the first or however many chances there were. Rather, when they see them, they're like, let's help them. Let's bring them to reality. Let's bring them to life, full life, the life with Christ, the life in God. And they want to do that very much. So it's not that they don't care about these people. It's just that their love for these people will not stop short of letting their unhappiness bleed into them, bleed into the blessed. And they won't submit to being controlled as a form of love, because they reject that as a form of love. So it's one of the great parts of the book is that the healing power of God is not just done in miracle stories. It's done through day-by-day work of those who seek to follow in the Christian path. As Lewis made the observation about himself in The Problem of Pain, I'll make the observation regarding myself. Don't think I follow this all the time and live it, okay? I am not, Lewis opens The Problem of Pain by saying, the reason I didn't want to write this book when my publisher asked me to do it is because I do not live up to all the brave statements I'm about to make in this book. I identify with him on that one. So as, again, to quote Lewis, a sinful man living a sinful life, I nonetheless recognize the validity of the truths that Lewis is teaching us. And I do not purport to have achieved the level of serenity of even the people who get, manage to get converted after they get off the bus. But I think it's important to say that, again, it's grace. It's not a test. The people on the bus turn themselves away. They can stay. They're welcome to stay. They just have to stop obsessing over themselves and love, period. Just love. Love God, love those around them, just love. But if they want to wallow in the suffering, they're not going to make the cut. So that openness to love is, I think, something we have seen and is one of the few redeeming virtues we see in crises. I described some of the bitterness that we've seen, and look, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. I don't see it as being my mission to pretty up the picture. We've all seen the sort of things that have not been people at their best in these past few months. But we have also seen people do amazing things. We have seen nurses and doctors and just ordinary people going out of their way to be kind. And it's been inspirational. And when I earlier pointed up the division in the country and the levels of unquiet that we see with people seizing symbols, yes, that's true, but we're also seeing people work together in ways that we don't often see. We talk about the partisan divide, but one of the things that New York's governor keeps pointing out is a lot of the work he's doing is in conjunction with the Republican head of the Governors Association. And they're working together for the good of all the people in the country, the whole Governors Association. They're all working together to try to make conditions better for those suffering from the pandemic and to help contain the pandemic. And we've all seen stories of doctors who have come out of retirement. I mean, I can tell you people who work for the state in agencies that have nothing to do with the pandemic or with the Department of Health or with the people who are having trouble getting unemployment. They are actually volunteering in their off hours to help process claims and to help get people the supplies they need. As much as the seamy side of humanity pokes through, so too does the gold. And I think the gold is where Lewis is pointing us to the love of God and of neighbor. And he's doing it in a very real, it seems, you can read this book as a cute little fantasy and a charming little parable. But what he's saying about the opportunity that we have every day to choose which path, love or self-obsession, we are given that fresh chance again and again. And a surprising number of people managed to, sorry, I've been practicing law for 30 years and I've only been a deacon for 5. So cynicism is something that can be attractive to me. I can fall into that old habit. But I have to say, some of the things I have seen and heard about from people who have done these deeds are deeply, deeply moving. And as much as we can be fractious and rebarbative and easily led to fury at each other, the better angels of our nature are there too. And they can be damned impressive. It can be an astonishing thing. So, a grief observed. This is the one where it's personal. I think what I love about this book is Lewis he's literally writing this in the days after his wife died. And it is his journal, and it is raw and it's rough, and it ain't easy to read, in the sense that he's really suffering and he's trying his best to be honest. And one of the things that is persistently tormenting him for the first 2/3 of the book is he keeps wanting to pretty up his wife in his memories. He keeps wanting to evoke memories of her where she's the perfect wife and she's so wonderful. Oh, the loss that I've had. He wants to be the tragedian from the Great Divorce. But because Joy was very sarcastic and constantly took him down a peg when he was getting too sentimental and too, oh, isn't everything wonderful? He can't do that without betraying her memory, and he manages to stop himself again and again. A Grief Observed it's arresting because you remember the start where he basically grabs us. I never knew grief was so much like fear. I mean, what a great opening line. And until almost the very end of the book, we're dealing with someone whose grief is very sharp and recurs in powerful and different ways. And part of what he's missing, as much as the joy and the happiness of their marriage, is the stark reality of this very different person who challenged him, who sometimes outwitted him, who would deflate his pretensions, who saw his foibles and loved him anyway, just as he saw hers and loved her. And so it's a very moving portrayal of a marriage between two people, both writers, and both very committed to their faith. And yet, as she was dying, he was afraid. He was afraid to lose her. He was terrified to lose her. He was, when her pain from the cancer was really horrible, he struggled with staying with her and couldn't even bear to think about God at moments. And there were moments where he feels walled off from God. And yet, even in those moments, he knows he's going to believe in God. His problem is, how does he believe in a loving God? Here's the thing that gets me about this book, and I just read it this afternoon, actually, preparing for this class. Just preparing to speak about this book with you because I haven't had a chance to read it in a while, but I knew I wanted to visit it again. Unlike any of his other books, there's no tight, hermetically sealed, perfect ending. Lewis does not completely come out of his grief. We leave him still in the middle of his grief. Basically, what happens is he has 2 notebooks, and he decides he's not going to buy a third to continue this story, because he thinks, if I do that, I'll start wallowing in it, and it'll be a 4th and a 5th, and so on and so on. So he's going to stop when he runs out of the notebooks he has in the house as the date of her death. And that's just 2. That's why it's the book is actually quite short. It's, in my copy, it's only 60 pages. And it ends with a farewell to Joy, who is not called Joy. He published this book anonymously, by the way. In the first printing is anonymous. And it's written under a pseudonym, N.W. Clerk, which is a reference to an early poem he wrote many years ago. And N.W. Clerk only refers to his wife as H throughout the book. He was hoping that it would not be discovered who he was, that he could write this and publish it with privacy. His literary style is so recognizable, and it was so well known, particularly at the time, that he could not escape detection. And so he was caught very quickly. But here's how he describes Joy. For H's mind was lithe and quick and muscular as a leopard. Passion, tenderness, and pain were all equally unable to disarm it. It scented the first whiff of cant or slush, then sprang and knocked you over before you knew what was happening. How many bubbles of mine she pricked. I soon learned not to talk rot to her unless I did it for the sheer pleasure, and there's another red-hot jab, of being exposed and laughed at. I was never less silly than as H's lover. And so this woman who really fit with him, but not in a conventional way. She continued writing her own poetry and her own articles. She continued her own work for as long as she could. He is constantly tempted to remember the image of her and make an idol of her. And only the fact of her less smooth side, of her sense of humor at his expense, of their quarrels, which were mostly intellectual quarrels or theological quarrels, that's what keeps him honest. And he's struggling with God in this book. And again, we talk about Job, but here is Lewis at the depth of his grief. Because she's in God's hands, people say. But if so, she was in God's hands all the time, and I've seen what they did to her here. Do they suddenly become gentler to us the moment we are out of the body? And if so, why? If God's goodness is inconsistent with hurting us, then either God is not good or there is no God. For in the only life we know, he hurts us beyond our worst fears and beyond all we can imagine. If it is consistent with hurting us, then he may hurt us after death as unendurably as before. Sometimes it is hard not to say, God forgive God. Sometimes it is hard to say so much. But if our faith is true, he didn't. He crucified him. Now, C.S. Lewis has come to take on a sheen of orthodoxy, of being the symbol of orthodoxy in Anglicanism. There are many people who you will see describe themselves as C.S. Lewis Christians. That passage is as dark as anything in Job and as angry in anything in Job. But like Job, he does not curse God. He refuses to give up. And he keeps struggling, and he struggles past the anger. And he struggles to get to a notion of a God who's good. And so he says, well, maybe God is like a Calvinist and thinks we need to be punished for our own good. And he rejects that theory pretty quickly. And then he tries, well, maybe it's because we all need stakes. We need rewards or punishment, or we don't care about the game. He's drawing an analogy between a friend of his who was a gambler and who always said, well, if the stakes aren't high, you won't play well. But that doesn't work for him either. So then he goes on, and he thinks maybe God is like a veterinarian and we're the animals. And we don't understand the treatment we're getting. But can't the treatment still be good? And yet he has this vision of the vet who never stops the treatment, and it's a nightmare to him.
Mm.
And so then we get a curious paragraph. What sort of lover am I to think so much about my affliction and so much less about hers? Even the insane call, come back, is all for my own sake. I never even raised the question whether such a return, if it were possible, would be good for her. I want her back as an ingredient in the restoration of my past. Could I have wished her anything worse? Having got once through death to come back and then again at some later date, have all her dying to do over again? They call Stephen the first martyr. Hasn't Lazarus gotten the raw ordeal? And so you can see this man of deep faith from the 1930s, certainly, all the way into 1961. And he is really grappling with God in a way he hasn't since he first found faith all those years ago as an Oxford undergraduate. And he's not liking it. These struggles are not fun for him, because every book he ever wrote on the subject of God, he feels that he's not sure if it's true anymore. Can he really hold to those books that he wrote? The Problem of Pain, for example. He doesn't cite the books. I'm just drawing that conclusion myself. Then he has a night where he wakes up after having had a dream, a vision, a memory. He's not clear. But he's had the experience of being with joy. With the lucid, funny, caring joy, not romantic, not sexual in this case, but just like the pleasure of a good chat with her. And he wakes up and the grief has lifted temporarily, not for long, but he has a moment where he sees that it's not all lost. It's not all loss. He's not completely bereft, and that God still cares for him, that God still loves him, and that having dreamed of joy or seen joy or whatever it is that happened to him, Lewis thinks of her as she was, again, not by effort, not by will, but just easily. And that refreshes him to the point where his grief is bearable. It's still there. He doesn't get an easy way out. He's not cured, but he is more aware of what he's lost, but of the value of it. And his love for her begins to predominate over his self-pity. And that's when Lewis starts moving towards the end of the book. The book does not end with a classic Lewis ratification of the faith. It does not end with certainties the way you would expect a C.S. Lewis book about God to end. But he does say, and I think this is powerful. Once very near the end of Joy's life, I said, if you can, if it is allowed, come to me when I too am on my deathbed. Allowed, she said. Heaven would have a job to hold me, and as for hell, I'd break it into bits. She knew she was speaking a kind of mythological language, with even an element of comedy in it. There was a twinkle as well as a tear in her eye. But there was no myth and no joke about the will, deeper than any feeling that flashed through her. Didn't people dispute once whether the final vision of God was more an act of intelligence or of love? That is probably another nonsense question, like, is yellow square or oval? And finally he says, how wicked it would be if we could to call the dead back. She said, not to me, but to the chaplain. I am at peace with God. She smiled, but not at me. And so the last thing we take from A Grief Observed is not Lewis's grief, not any heroic resolutions or resting on his part, but rather a very keen aware of how much she loved him and how much she loved God. That Joy had become one of the, like the woman in the Great Divorce, she had become one of those people who brought God with her and had God in her heart. Because the love, he describes their love early in the book, A Grief Observed, as passionate, and everything that a sinful man and a sinful woman could be to each other, we were. And here at the end, we see her almost as exemplifying in her last hours with him that selfless love that is rooted in God rather than rooted in fear or obsession or desire for control. And so I guess in visiting these Lewis books with you, I wanted to spend some time looking at more modern and more familiar, more explicable to us ways of dealing with the fundamental problem faced by Job. How do we deal with suffering? Lewis dealt with suffering by experience, by living through it, by struggling for as long as he had to not lose sight of who he loved, why he loved her, and that love was a refraction of the love of God. That his love for her, her love for him, were all bound up in the fact that they were creatures of God who loved their Creator. And that the selfless love can't be eaten up by the desire to possess, the desire to bring back the spirit, the desire to have her back, to feel, so he could feel better, so he could have his precious past back. And in moving forward, Lewis acknowledges nothing's ever going to be the same again. The old normal will not come back for him. But a new way of being, which he hasn't quite reached until at the end of the book, but which is beginning to shape itself, and he's beginning to perceive its outlines, that he is beginning to see. Much like I think we will not, I don't know that we'll ever be exactly where we started. Probably not. We're 100,000 people lost. That's a lot of stories that ended prematurely. We are a people who have now lived under a sort of benign house arrest for months at a time. And how are we going to deal if there are reoccurrences? And how are we going to, you know, if the trend starts upward again with infections? We'll have to take more radical action. We have to re-envision how we live in some ways, not in every way, the fundamentals of being the church in the world, of loving God and loving each other and supporting each other. Those will stay. But navigating this complicated world has gotten a little more complicated. And I don't think we're going to get an easy answer that will just be one simple sentence declaring it's over, you'll never have to worry again. I think we are more aware of our vulnerability than we've been at any time in my lifetime. And maybe that's why we've been struggling against it and against each other so hard. Because it's easier for us to have an adversary we can look at and the familiar old divides of party or political philosophy or who's going to wear a mask and who's not. All of those are easier to fall back into and let those animate us than to jump into the unknown with the leap of faith. Yet Lewis only got out of the worst of his grief, the deadening part, the part that was costing him his relationship with God, his clear-eyed view of the woman he loved, when he made that leap of faith, even though he didn't have a good, solid answer. No more than Job did. God roars out at Job at the end of the story. Who were you when I did this, when I created this, when I created that? But as we said last week, there's not an answer in that. The answer is in Job refusing to give up on God, just as God refuses to give up on Job. So, questions, concerns, snide remarks? People wishing you'd watched Gladiator instead?
I wonder if there's a certain rhythm to people's expectations. And maybe for most people, that rhythm is being directed from outward influence, whoever it is you listen to. Friends, family, the governor, the president, read what you're reading. And I wonder how complicated it's going to be for people to calibrate if there is a much larger second wave to this. But this is as though it's a very, very extended sudden loss. It's been a few months. And I certainly from the people I'm talking to, are ready to move through the end of the grief cycle. And the virus, of course, doesn't care. And so I'm wondering how do we arm ourselves? How do we arm our people? How do you arm parishioners? What does one do in case, and I'm not saying we should all wring our hands, assuming October will be terrible or something, but there's an arc to this that feels like an extended grief. It's not a week or 6 weeks or, but people are ready to stop grieving. How does one prepare if it does start to rise again and much more aggressively? But I fear people will be broken.
I think that's probably true. And my own feeling is that we have to, the best approach, and ironically in the blurb for this series, I quoted Leonard Cohen, and I have to go back to Cohen. Love's the only engine of survival, he writes in an otherwise dark song called The Future. And I think that how do we arm our parishioners? How do we arm ourselves? How do we go through the world day by day is we keep close to us those people in our lives who fundamentally disagree with us, yet who are a part of our lives because they love us. So if I may give an example, I have a relative whose views are on every subject wildly different from my own. In religion, much more conservative.
Don't we all?
Yes. But here's the thing. This relative genuinely loves me. We don't agree on much, but we do love each other. She sends amazingly thoughtful birthday presents that are books that she knows. She's a compulsive reader too. It's one of the few things we share. And she goes out there and she scours the bookstores to find things that she thinks will strike my interest. And she does a great job. She almost never comes up with one that's a dud because she's thinking of me, not of herself. And while we disagree, if we get into conversations about deep theological matters, we can share an enormous amount just by loving each other and accepting each other and not letting ourselves see the other as a caricature. I think the dehumanization of those who are opposed to us on political subjects, religious subjects, whatever, anything you can get past, football, whatever. It's very easy to get angry and self-righteous. Trust me, I've done it a lot. But in Bernard Shaw's play St. Joan, there's a great speech when Joan is burned at the stake. The man who's been pushing for her to be burned at the stake, the chaplain, rushes in, having seen it, and gives this long, plaintive speech about how he'd never expected it to be as horrible as it was. And it was so easy to throw fuel on the fire of his righteous rage, defending the church and defending the king and defending what he believed in. But if he'd ever thought of what it really meant in the real world, he'd never have done it. And he's broken by the fact that his wild advocacy has led to harm and death and cruelty. And he grieves. I know that's like the most short and unhelpful answer to a really great and profound question. So maybe I'll open it up and if anyone else has thoughts. But that's what little I have on the spot.
But it's not unhelpful.
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
No, I mean it.
You had me worried.
I wasn't grasping at straws, or I'm not right now on Memorial Day weekend. I'm looking ahead, and I'm concerned.
No, I understand. I do understand. I just didn't want to fob you off with something light.
No, you didn't. But bringing up the opposite. I mean, gosh, we need all the people and all the energy and all the love and all the. We're robbed of the micro moments that fill out our day with love.
Yes.
Little moments with strangers, because not only because we're isolated, but because most of our faces are covered. And I'm so aware, because I do go out and go to the laundromat and go to the supermarket, and it's very stressful. But all of those micro moments that we all, unless you live the life of a true ascetic, that we all crave. It's real nourishment. We're robbed of that because of the physical isolation and because we can't see each other fully. So no, that relating a relative who, is intellectually an adversary but emotionally a kindred spirit.
I totally agree with Peter. We're robbed of those lovely moments that we can share love with people. And we have to take care of ourselves. I got myself this morning thinking about some, going down a bad stream of politics, listening to NPR radio or something. And I had to stop myself. I said, this is just like evil coming in your brain. Just stop it. And I listened to Deborah's thing. I read the Forward Day by Day. We have to counter all these negative things with extra effort to listen to the sermons, listen to the good things that are happening that we can read. I listen to Mission St. Clair. I read Melody Beattie's books, day by day kind of thing. You have to take care of yourself. And especially, I live alone. I have neighbors here that are wonderful, and we have 6 feet apart. We can feel those nice moments. But it's so important to fight off the bad things that can come in. You have to self-care, I think.
And don't be afraid to be silly. If there's something frivolous and silly and absurd that you enjoy, watch it, read it,
funny
whatever.
Movies, yes.
Funny movies. Read P.G. Wodehouse if that's your thing. Whatever brings you a spark of joy. Yeah. Go for it. Noel Coward has never been more relevant.
Extra. You have to do extra more than you normally do.
Yes. So that is something that I've been doing too. I mean, I literally, as a part of my discipline, not spiritual discipline, but as a way of keeping myself as fit as possible, is I make sure I watch something absurdly amusing at least once a day. Just something small, just read or watch something ridiculously funny and enjoy it.
Good point. Thank you for the reminder.
Animals are great too if you've got them. I mean, I have to tell you, my wife and I have cats, and they are so therapeutic.
King, where are you? Now he won't show up, of course.
I see Sue has some critter there too. A dog or a cat.
Because it's been raised, gotta tell you, Sue, we love seeing your cat come to visit during these classes.
She's always there.
Totally
Pretty
delightful.
good. She's taking a bath.
Oh, what a
You're
love.
really
But
fluffy.
there's a window, so that's her spot, I guess. I'm in
Oh, she's
her
beautiful.
zone.
She's absolutely beautiful.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Maybe I should ring the doorbell, then he'll show up again. He loves the ding dong on Zoom. That brings him every time.
Well, John, thank you for all the intelligent things you say, that you open our eyes to so many more things than just the book and all the connections to it. So you're amazing in your breadth of knowledge of all these things. So thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you. You're most kind. And thank you for being here tonight. And I hope to see you all next week. And I really appreciate your taking the time to be with us tonight.
What should we read for next week? Was this?
Absolute Truths by Susan Howich.
Okay, I read that once. I got to go find it.
Yep.
Okay, good.
What was that again?
Absolute Truths by Susan Howich.
It's a really good series. It's the last one of the
It
series?
is the last one.
Yeah. It's a page-turning series. You really like it. It's about a mystic. And John has done a series on John Darrow, I think, before.
That is true.
Really good.
That's true. I did do these books a few years ago. We did a series on it, and it was great fun. This is going to be, we're going to focus on the last one, but there will be callbacks to the earlier ones.
So could you tell me again her last name, Susan?
Howich, Howatch.
And we'll include a link to that in the e-news on Friday.
That's a good
thank
idea.
you.
Thank
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
worth it.
And Peter, thank you for bailing me out. I was a nervous wreck. I couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong. It was so obvious as to be ridiculous.
We got there eventually.
It's okay.
Thank you, Peter, for all your
Thank you,
kind
Peter, for all your
assistance.
technological stuff.
So there was a play a few years ago, The Great Divorce, at the Signature. Did anyone see that?
I didn't. I believe it was based on the book, though, if I'm not
Oh,
mistaken.
yes, definitely. And it was very good.
Oh, I'm delighted.
Yeah. And
Also,
apparently when I was looking it up today, it appeared on Broadway and various places else, not just what we saw off Broadway.
It's got some interesting characters, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Well, thank
Okay,
you all
guys.
so much.
Have a
Have
great
a good night. See you next
Bye,
week.
Good
thanks,
night.
Sue.
Okay.
Thanks, John.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good week.